Hello and welcome to J Hutch Talks Too Much. I am your host, J Hutch. Although tonight I am the examining magistrate, and here with me is our Herr R. How are you? He's done something, but we don't know. I can't do the accent. I tried.
Go. I'm good. I'm a little indisposed due to the charges that have been unfairly brought against me.
Unfairly,
so I would like to clear my name.
Well, but do we know unfairly? They might be quite fairly.
Maybe. Yeah, I don't feel like I've done anything in particular.
You might recall R from our previous discussion on Plato's Republic. He is also got a great YouTube channel called, it's Ryan Cook. Is that correct?
That's right. That's not my name. My name's unknown, but yes, that's coincidentally starts with R.
And you'll find R sometimes performing some, oftentimes, in fact, performing some fantastic songs that he has
once a week.
Written. Once a week, and
that's what they say.
And I have been watching a lot of these live concerts, and they were always good, but they are getting better and better as they go on. So sometimes R is ill and calls them short.
Like last week.
But they are always very entertaining and worth checking out.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about a little bit about your project?
Yeah, sure. Right off the bat?
Or do you want to talk about it later?
Let's talk about it later so that, I don't know. Yeah.
Well, we can get into then right now we can talk about Kafka's The Trial, which this is my version.
This is my version.
Oh yeah, that's a very cool cover. I like that one.
It is. What's the translation? Or do we have the same translation?
My translator is Idris Pari.
Oh yes, I've heard of that. I've never seen that. I've got the Mitchell translation, which is fairly new.
Yeah.
I think that the Mirror translation is the standard one. The one that most people have read.
Curious to see how, if it comes up through our discussion, how the different translations might differ from one another. If they have any significant differences in terms of the overall.
we can look into it. We can even test a couple of sentences and see.
That would be great. So I have talked about Kafka already on this channel. I talked about him the last time. I'm kind of maybe doing a series of videos on him. So the last one, I sort of introduced Kafka and talked about his stories, The Judgment and Metamorphosis. I would say this is probably the most well-known of Kafka's works. Would you say that? Maybe Metamorphosis is kind of one of those two.
Probably Metamorphosis is something that has more cultural cachet. Like, it seems like everyone knows essentially what it's about, whereas it seems to me like more people have maybe actually read The Trial. I don't know. I have no idea.
Now that I'm thinking about it, maybe it's like people know the story of the guy turning into the bug.
Yeah.
And then people know the title of The Trial.
Yeah, that's right.
That might be how these books have been remembered in the cultural memory.
That's right.
But I will say, and I actually was not thinking about this when I asked you to come on to talk about it. On the cover of my book, The Trial, for those of you who don't know, R is a scholar of philosophy, is a teacher of philosophy. And on the cover it says this, a quote from the Sunday Times, as we all know, is one of the most reputable periodicals that's out there. One of the greatest philosophical works of the century. The 20th century.
Interesting.
But I mostly actually thought of you because it does seem like you and I maybe have very similar trajectories in terms of the kind of literature we gravitated towards at similar times. Like, I do feel like I remember when we roughly around the time that we first met, we started talking about reading sort of Dostoevsky and high school and things like that. and all of that. And then I think it's an easy slip from Dostoevsky into Kafka, and he's kind of one of the ones I went to in my early 20s, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I had read Kafka.
I don't know about you. I don't know when did you first start?
I read Kafka first in high school. It was one of the books that I got from, I think, Jd Salinger. You know, like definitely the way that I got books most often in high school, pre-internet, was reading something and then finding out that that person liked other things. You know,
yes.
So like Jd Salinger was like a wellspring of a lot of different authors that I heard about through him, you know, and my knowledge of literature really came that way. I don't know. Probably something similar.
Because that's what I do, exactly that sort of thing. And I still am kind of a little bit on a Salinger kick. Actually, just a few weeks ago, I purchased this book.
Oh, I reread that a couple of maybe a year ago.
Yeah. So those of you who are only listening, it's Raise High the Roof Beam Carpenters and Seymour, an Introduction by Jd Salinger, which I've never read this one.
So I'm excited. Well, it's good. The Seymour, you got to be in the right mood. It's definitely digressive intentionally, but I liked it. I don't know.
Yeah, and so if you actually go to Jd Salinger's Wikipedia page, there's a section of it where they apparently did an interview in the early 50s, I think, where he was asked to name his favorite authors, and he in this interview he only would name authors who were dead, although he named one that was accidentally still alive, I think, or he accidentally named one that was still alive. It wasn't an accident that they were still alive, but,
right?
And the first person on his list was Kafka, which is interesting. It really does make sense when you start to think about it, but they're also they're stylistically quite different, but you can see the similarities there.
Yeah, for sure. Is that the interview that a high school student did with him?
I do know of that interview, but I don't know if
it. It might not be the same one. Anyway, yeah, that's interesting.
They show. Did you ever watch? Sorry, we are going to talk about Kafka tonight, but just a brief little sojourn into Jd Salinger. Did you ever see the biopic on Jd Salinger that came out a few years ago?
No, I didn't. I didn't ever see it.
It was. I wouldn't recommend it, but it was.
No, I don't need to know the terrible details of his life. I have the feeling that he was a bad person, and I don't care to know.
They didn't actually dwell on that aspect too much.
Really? Yeah. I've heard some horrible things.
But it was, But it was it was very much like one of those biopic kind of movies where they just gloss over things, and they desperately want to like forge a narrative of somebody's life, and so like, anyways, it's pretty superficial, but we'll do Salinger. I'll do a whole run of Salinger videos on here someday too, hopefully. So yeah, what was your when you first read The Trial? Then do you remember your first impressions of it?
Yeah, I remember my first impressions. Actually, before I read The Trial, I think the first Kafka I read was in the penal colony.
Yeah.
And somehow I got the diaries. Like, you know, it was whatever was available in Kitchener Waterloo, basically, is what my MO was for reading stuff. And so by the time I read The Trial, I knew enough about him. I was in high school. I think I knew a little bit about like existentialism. Like I think I'd read like Camus and those things, you know. And so my initial feeling about it was like, you know, this is a symbolic tale about life, which I suppose it is. I don't feel like I got all of the richness that I got out of it recently. I think I might have read it once between high school and rereading it for doing this with you. I've read other Kafka since then. But I do feel like I don't remember it being as detailed, and I don't remember it being as weird. It's one of these books for me that like the trees get lost for the forest very easily, because the central story is so big and so simple in a way that like it's just difficult for me to remember the details. They get swept up in the key narrative.
Yeah.
So I remember finishing it and definitely getting the feeling that this was a book that was unfinished. And that was an impression I can remember from being, I don't know, 16 or something.
Yeah. which for those who are watching and are not familiar with the story, the trial is an unfinished novel, just like all of Kafka's novels. They are all unfinished, but with the trial, what's kind of unique about the trial is that it does have a final chapter. So it's both unfinished but has a final chapter in it, and the reason for that is because when he was writing the trial, Kafka had a kind of momentary episode of intense self-awareness, which I guess he really almost always had. It probably wasn't momentary. He seemed to be maybe overly self-aware, but with that self-awareness, he decided, okay, I never finish anything. My projects tend to be very unwieldy. So to motivate myself to finish this, I'll write the first chapter first, and then the last chapter second, and then I'll fill in details from there.
I did not know that.
Yeah, and so that's what ends up happening, and of course he doesn't end up finishing it. So the story. I don't know how much more there would have been to it, but as we talked about it over the last couple of days, the book begins on his 30th birthday. It ends right before he's about to turn 31. So assuming about a year's time has taken place, but we only really get the first couple of weeks and then a jump cut ahead basically to a year later when the grand finale takes place. But just to maybe just go over the plot a little bit, and then I'm curious as to what you think the weirdest parts of this book are, because there are some very strange sort of episodes in it. But as you say, I am myself a little bit. I've been reading this and rereading this over the last couple of weeks, and I'm still kind of fuzzy on the details. But the long and short of it is, and you jump in whenever you want.
Sure.
The central character Joseph K wakes up. It's his 30th birthday. He rings for his breakfast, and in come these two wardens who tell him that he's under arrest for a crime they themselves don't know, and so they can't tell him what it is that he's committed. And then through the process of the book is him largely. Now they also tell him, yes, you're under arrest, but you can still go to work. You're still pretty much free to do whatever you want. It's just that occasionally, you'll have to come in and come to the assembly to have a hearing and things like that. But through the course of the book, neither Kay nor the audience ever becomes aware of what Kay has done, if he has done anything at all. We don't find that out, and then he just goes through kind of this series of episodes where he tries to, he at first tries to kind of ignore it. And then his uncle comes and basically says, you can't ignore this anymore. He takes him to an advocate. The advocate purportedly fights on his behalf, but Kay doesn't think he's doing a good enough job. Anyway, are there details in the middle that you think are important before we get to the end?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of key scenes that we should talk about that aren't in your analysis, but I think your plot that's the long and short of it.
Yeah. And so if anybody doesn't want this story to be spoiled, I'll just say it right now. You can cover your ears over the next minute. But the last chapter is a year later, right before he's about to turn 31. Two more people come to his door, carry him off. He basically recognizes, okay, this is about it. They take him out. They pass a knife between the two of them, the two guys, and eventually they murder him. And that's it. He dies, as if the shame would outlive him. So that's how the story ends. But okay, so with that in mind, yeah. So what are your initial thoughts?
So my initial thoughts, like speaking to you about this book, it seems like there are at least two main ways that people understand it. And I was expecting that you would probably take more of a political, social angle, so focusing on bureaucracy and those kinds of things, and totalitarianism. I, for that reason, was reading it with an eye to thinking of it as like an existential / religious parable.
Right.
So you know, bringing that to the table, I was thinking, you know, the large headline is like, this is a guy that is trying to cope with something that is so large and big and powerful and incomprehensible that he can't possibly find a rational response to it. And the rest of his life becomes an attempt to deal with it. And perhaps he would have been better off ignoring it. So maybe the thing in question is death. Maybe it's God. Maybe it's some sense of like, how can you justify your existence against something that would call you to account? I don't know. Something like that. Yeah, and we were talking, I was thinking that maybe the age 30 when he gets arrested was significant in this respect, simply because that seems to be, for many people, the age where they start realizing like, oh, I probably will die. You know, like, you know it before then, but usually at 30, it's like, you actually start to feel like, okay, this is actually something that will also affect me. Certainly it was like that for me. I don't know. So, yeah.
It does definitely seem like at certain points he's confronting something about his life that he doesn't necessarily want to admit to himself. And there's one point, for example, where he goes. So he's initially called to this to his first hearing, which ends up being, again, just to sort of emphasize the strangeness of the story. It doesn't take place in any sort of traditional court of law. And every time he talks about it, he has to clarify that it's not your traditional court, it's some other kind of court. And so this court is like, he locates it in these tenement buildings, basically, and it's in the attics of these buildings that he goes to. And by the way, there's just endless sort of scenes of claustrophobia in this book. A lot of claustrophobia. Everywhere he goes, there's like it's just crammed full of people, or something about it is stifling. He's always kind of talking about rooms as if they're stifling him. So he goes to this first hearing, and it is this crammed room, and he gives this starts to give this speech, and he really thinks he's getting the crowd on his side, but then he realizes that they're all basically against him. Anyway, he goes again. The next time he goes, he hasn't even been called this time, and he goes on his own because they stopped sending him letters to come. So he just goes. And while he's there, because nothing can happen, nobody's called for him, he gets taken to this sort of waiting room where all these other defendants are sitting. And as soon as he sees them, he has this like spell where he feels ill, and he doesn't feel well again until he leaves. And there is something about, he's recognizing now other people as if like, oh, this is possibly, I read it as, this is possibly the fate that awaits me, where this character is incapable of communicating now because he's been in this legal entanglement for, I think, a month, he says. And it is this like, he's come face to face with his future, and you could read that potentially as his own mortality or something like that.
Yeah. And I remember Kay asks him, what are you trying to do? And he tries to answer by saying, I'm trying to do, and then filling in the rest. And he's incapable of describing what he thinks he's doing. And eventually he's pushed, and he can come out with something about launching a certain petition. But yeah, it seems like that's one of the first times where the K character, starts to take seriously the trial, because it seems like, you know, in the beginning, his approach is, first of all, to think it's a joke and to think it's a social thing. And he's principally worried at first about what other people will think. Other people watching him, it seems like, and, you know, he thinks immediately, this is a joke. It's my 30th birthday. People have set me up. And he tries to think if he can find somebody who's intelligent and not an underling, someone of his social position, he'll be able to deal with it, right? But then he can't find someone who is of his social position that gives him any help. I mean, it seems like most of the people he talks to, with the exception of the priest at the end, seem to be people that he would identify as lower, right? Like the painter, I guess the grain merchant Block, who we could probably talk about later, but that looks like a figure who's roughly equivalent or was. But yeah, it's what I was starting to say is it's interesting how he's pushed to take the trial seriously. Mostly, it seems, by observing the reactions of others.
Yeah.
And it's scary to him that there are these people that are devoting all of this time to the trial when he is not caring. And he doesn't seem to have any additional reason to care other than observing the fact that other people care.
Yeah. Although it is interesting at that point, too. I think you're absolutely right. And even then, like, he's still, after that point, because you're right, I think that is a moment where he's kind of aware of this, the gravity of this. And then after that, he kind of puts it aside again, because then the uncle shows up, and the uncle's like, why aren't you taking this more seriously than you are? And then eventually, after meeting with the advocate, he says, I've begun to kind of take this seriously now. But even in that, even before that moment where he meets other defendants and has that dizzy spell, like, as I said, this was all happening. He was having this confrontation because he went there of his own volition, right? He wasn't even summoned there on that day, right? He was like, well, it's Sunday, so I was there last Sunday, so I'll go this Sunday. And one of the points that I raised in the last video I did on Kafka, when I talked about the story, The Judgment, and I don't know if you read The Judgment, but I suggest
I have.
Yeah, so I suggest that one of the things that's I think Kafka is suggesting about power in that story is that it only really works if you sort of submit to it in some way. Like, there's no reason why Jörg Bendemann in the Judgment should go and jump into the river just because the father said, I condemn you to death by drowning, right? It doesn't really make sense.
Right.
But it works because Jörg has submitted to it. And I part of me thinks that even though Kay is so hesitant at first about taking this seriously, that eventually he does kind of fall prey to this, like, acceptance that he's now part of this system in some way.
Yeah. I mean, by the end, I imagine that if more of the middle section of the book had been written, like, he seems to be making moves to leave his job, right? Like, his relationship to his work is becoming more and more tenuous. He's spending more and more time on his trial. He's deciding to fire his lawyer, and his thought is that he will put his all into the trial. And you're right. Like, he seems to not have much of an issue when he doesn't engage with it. Like, maybe he would. It's hard to say what would happen if he didn't care. But interestingly, even in the first scene, like, it's odd in the first scene because he's laying in bed and nothing's happening, and he's recognized that the normal maid that brings him his breakfast hasn't come. And then he rings the bell to get her, and that's when they arrest him. Like, it's odd that even there, it's not like they just bust in. Like, he's actually the one who does something that gets them to come in. Yeah, and he doesn't mean to call them in, but it's his action that really, it's like they're waiting. And certainly at the end, the same sort of thing happens in a more pronounced way because he's being led to his end, and he's voluntarily doing it. Like, there are people around. He could very well stop and try to hesitate, and it seems like if he holds out, maybe they won't get him to take him where they're taking him. But he, at some point, just acquiesces. Like, this is inevitable.
Yeah. He even he's a police officer, right, along the way. He's like, maybe
that's another thing for people that maybe haven't read the book or haven't read it recently. It's not that this judicial body that is trying him is the official state police. Like, we don't actually know who these people are.
Yeah.
And the lawyer at some point that he consults differentiates between, like, legal cases in what seems to be the standard, federal or municipal or state court system versus this.
Yeah.
And this is different. And we don't know who's responsible.
Right. And ultimately, and I don't want to necessarily dwell, because I talked about this more when I talked about The Judgment. So I don't think this is the only way to see the trial, but like, it could very well be that this organization is just nothing. Like, it's just like a kind of a flimsy thing, right? And it's all just dependent on, like, as the priest says in that final scene, and I think we'll probably have to talk a fair amount about that.
That's a pretty key moment.
Yeah, where the priest says, I put it down. This is at least how it's written in my book. one does not have to believe everything is true. One only has to believe it is necessary. And so, like, again, like that seems to be the same thing, like the same belief that's undergirding Jorg Bendeman in the Judgment, and what makes this whole system function in any way, that people don't believe that there's any truth behind it. They just believe and have to believe in some ways that it has to happen. This is the way of things. There's a bit of a war is over if you want it.
That probably. Yeah, I was. That's what called my mind to this sort of spiritual / religious / existential interpretation. Because when you're a child, if you do have an encounter with someone who for the first time tells you that you have some kind of spiritual guilt or something that you have to do in order to save yourself, it's a very foreign idea, I feel like, to a lot of kids. And it's really something that your first encounter with it is usually through other people saying, like, hey, this is something you need to take very seriously. Right? Like whether it be a family member. And a lot of times I imagine that for a lot of kids, their initial response is, I don't know what this is. And other people seem to think that I should care deeply about this thing. And so I suppose I should, because everyone else does. And then you end up caring deeply about it. I mean, not that that's all there is to it, but definitely, like, I could imagine that that's part of what Kafka's trying to say, perhaps because, it's like he doesn't care. And then it's like other people care. And it's a very bad feeling when other people care deeply about something that you think is irrelevant. Like you really think you're missing out.
Yeah.
And that seems to be what haunts him. Mind you, they can also do horrible things to him, but
yeah. Well, that's a really interesting way of putting it, because somewhere along the line, and unfortunately, I've looked at so many things about this book in the last week or so. I don't know who it was that said this, but somebody I was reading or listening to said that every Kafka character is in some ways a child, and which is another. It's that also makes it kind of fascinating why Salinger gravitated towards him, because all of Salinger's characters are pretty much all children too.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Or adults whose greatest achievements, like in the Glass family case, came when they were children and were basically in a state of arrested development. Yeah, that's right.
And so, the text that I did the last time, Metamorphosis and the Judgment, they weren't kids per se, but they were in their family organization, which was portrayed in those stories. They were the son rather than the father. Jorg Bendeman's the son. Gregor Samsa is the son. Now, in this book, it's not quite the same. I mean, there's the uncle, but that's not really the primary relationship that we're seeing in the story. But nevertheless, somebody does call Kay a child at some point. I can't remember who it is. It might be the advocate. But somebody calls him a child. And in some ways, it is like you can see how a lot of Kafka's characters are navigating through the world like children, like the way children do, because it's like when you're sitting in a room and you're 6 years old and you're hearing your parents talk around you or the adults talking around you, you can't connect with a lot of the things that they're talking about.
Right.
And that's exactly what so many of Kafka's characters are going through. It's like they are experiencing the world in a way that they're entirely disconnected from.
Yeah, that's right. And also they're doing things that they think are innocuous, but then other people scold them for, like, how could you have done that stupid thing? And it's like, once they see it, there's a sense of deep shame. Like there's a few times in the book where it seems like he feels a sense of deep embarrassment or shame that he could have been so stupid as to have done this. But you can imagine when he does it initially that this looks quite innocent to him. And he's always doing things like what we would call having a tantrum or something, right? Like he's always yelling at them. He thinks it's quite justified, but that's purely because he doesn't understand.
Yeah. Well, I have two kind of responses to that because I thought about that too. But have you ever noticed that Kay will sometimes do that to other people in the story as well? Like especially with his landlady.
Like what do you mean, like treating her like she doesn't know anything? Is that what you mean?
You can imagine that Kafka could write a story from her perspective and it would be exactly the same.
Right.
Like she would just eat. Like there's this guy who's walked in. He's like, the young people today sometimes they take things too far. And she's like, yeah, I know. The other day I saw Fraulein Brunster doing this, and he's like, don't ever talk to her about her like that.
He gets mad about that because she insinuates that she's loose, as they would say.
Yeah, that's right.
But then after he meets her, he just randomly decides to make out with her.
Yes, he does.
For no reason. And it's quite funny. I mean, it's definitely the case where, like, you brought up Harvey Weinstein last time. Is this like Harvey Weinstein's story where he just doesn't know what he's done wrong? But in fact, the details, I mean, this guy has, in the book, let's face it, done a couple of things that were highly questionable.
Yeah.
Like, you don't just start making out with someone that you don't even know what they look like 2 minutes before. Maybe there's enough here for us to put 2 and 2 together.
That maybe he is guilty of something.
Well, maybe this is how anyone feels when they get publicly excoriated for past sins. Like, well, I didn't even know I did anything wrong.
Yeah. So
I'm just joking. I mean, but yeah, it's interesting because there seem to be subtle hints that he's got issues. I don't know. It struck me as I mentioned, the sexuality feels really abrupt and weird. Like, it comes from nowhere. He's sitting with someone and suddenly they're on top of him. It happens a couple times.
It does happen a couple of times. It does. Well, I just want to quickly mention something about that scene because he goes into Fraulein. I can't remember her name.
Brunster or something like that.
Yeah. He goes into her room, and then he's telling her, he's apologizing to her because the people who came to arrest him that day ended up in her room and they moved things around. So he's apologizing. He's trying to explain how it went. And she clearly wants him out of her room. Like, she just does not want it. She keeps saying it's late. And there's a knock on the door. She's like, get out. Anyway, at a certain point, he like grabs her and he kisses her. And then he goes back to his room. And this is what I said in the book. Very soon he was asleep, but before falling asleep, he thought about his behavior. Okay. He thought about his behavior. He was satisfied with it.
Yeah. Exactly.
But surprised he was not even more satisfied, which suggests maybe there's a little bit of guilt there. But
exactly. I see that. Yeah, in this translation it says he was pleased with it. So similar. Yeah.
But
in mine it says he was surprised that he didn't feel even more pleased.
Right.
And then he says he's concerned about her, but not because of his own predatory behaviors. Rather, he's worried about the captain. Yeah, he goes into her room and he acts out the scene that took place earlier.
That's right.
He pretends to be the judge or whatever.
Yeah. But there is certainly a big sense of shame in the book because the book does begin when the people enter into the room and the people enter the room to arrest him. He keeps being fixated, understandably so, I think, on the person who's staring at him from the building next door, on this old woman. And then at the end of the book as well, and I think here is where it's noteworthy that he wrote these 2 chapters back to back. When he's being when he's being killed, obviously punished for his crime, there's also somebody watching.
There is, far away, and we don't. Yeah, that's right.
And then he says, and then there's the last words, which in my book were that the one of the killers says, like a dog, referring to Kay dying. Yep. And then the final sentence was, it was as if the shame would outlive him.
Yeah.
And I think, I could be wrong, but I think that in some ways it's because somebody has watched this. Like somebody has seen this moment where he is dying like a dog. And there are lots of moments like that. Like when the uncle comes to the bank and tries to talk to him, he's like, shh, let's go somewhere else because people are going to be listening. And and so I wonder if this is like I think I mentioned to you, this is a bit of I think in some ways this book, and I'll talk about this in a few minutes, but the book is kind of a response to a lot of sort of modern changes that were happening throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century. But you had this kind of Jeremy Bentham desire for a kind of a global surveillance, right? Bentham talked about wanting to turn the world into this place where everybody was always watching everybody and nobody would ever do anything wrong because you were always being watched. But obviously you'd always feel like you are under some kind of surveillance. And I think that there's, to some extent, there is that in this book where you're just constantly being watched, and that leaves you with all these feelings of guilt and shame.
Right.
But I agree with you that in some ways this is about a guy who's grappling with something really big, and along those lines, if you could just give me just a minute to read this out.
Sure.
I mentioned Max Weber to you,
Yeah.
and I don't know how familiar you are with his work.
I mean, this stuff about, in outline, the stuff about bureaucracy.
Yeah. So I got this actually from that. This is not a big scholarly source. I got this from the Stanford philosophy website. And this is them talking about some of Weber's views. So just spare me 1 minute here just to talk about it. So he says, this is them explaining his point of view. On the one hand, exact calculability. He's talking about the 19th century and what happened basically throughout that century. Exact calculability and predictability in the social environment that formal rationalization has brought about dramatically enhances individual freedom by helping individuals understand and navigate through the complex web of practice and institutions in order to realize the ends of their own choice. On the other hand, freedom and agency are seriously curtailed by the same force in history when individuals are reduced to a cog in a machine or trapped in an iron cage that formal rationalization has spawned with irresistible efficiency and at the extent of substantive rationality. Then they say this part: disenchantment had ushered in monotheistic religions in the West. So this is right, like, why did these monotheistic religions erupt? Basically, in practice, that means that ad hoc maxims for life conduct had been gradually displaced by a unified tonal system of meaning and value, which historically culminated in the Puritan ethic of vocation. Modern science was initially welcomed as a surrogate system of orderly value creation. But for Weber, modern science is a deeply nihilistic enterprise in which any scientific achievement worthy of the name must ask to be surpassed and made obsolete in a process that is in principle ad infinitum, at which point we come to the problem of the meaning of science. Irretrievably gone as a result is a unifying worldview, be it religious or scientific, and what ensues is its fragmentation into incompatible value spheres. Weber then is not envisioning a peaceful dissolution of the grand meta-narratives of monotheistic religion and universal science into a series of local narratives and the consequent modern pluralist culture in which different cultural practices follow their own immanent logic. His vision of polytheistic reenchantment is rather that of an incommensurable value fragmentation into a plurality of alternative meta-narratives, each of which claims to answer the same metaphysical questions that religion and science strove to cope with in their own ways. Okay, so that's a lot of big words there, but largely I think that what is being suggested is that throughout the course of like late 18th century, 19th century, you see this kind of turn away from all these sort of all-encompassing answers about what is going on in the universe, and you end up with a sort of plurality of possibilities. But you also see at the same time this rampant industrialization and bureaucratic creation, which kind of forces you into this sort of cog in a wheel. So you're both a cog in a wheel, and you are in this sort of totalizing system of which you can never really understand. Like there's just no fundamental way of knowing what is going on in the world because whatever system you had to understand it before is now gone. Am I basically getting that right? Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, it sounded like you what you read. The only thing that was also, it seems like it's twofold, because on the one hand you're reduced to a totalizing cog, but also there's a lot of freedom because you can plan, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it sounded like part of it is like, that the store closes at 8 o'clock, and that if you go there, no matter who you are, you can get bread.
Right.
And that there's a freedom to that too. But of course, the bottom line is that the person who is the bread seller is now the bread seller.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. which in some ways kind of speaks to Kay's thing too. Like the interesting thing is that, you know, the one thing he's told that he's definitely free to do is work.
Yeah.
You know, you can go do your job still. So I don't know. Like I don't know if this is if my explanation for what you're sort of seeing in the book. I think we might be seeing the same sort of things, but my explanation might be that like this is Kafka responding to this world that has changed in a significant way.
It could. I mean, I think the difference in the way that, well, it's not like I see the book differently, but I think for me, like what I focused on that's different is like to what extent this surveillance state, you know, modern urban environment thing is central to what he wants to say, and to what extent is it like part of a parable that could have been expressed in other ways. What I mean is like certainly the way that it gets expressed, like the feelings are through that, but I've always felt like there's more to it than just that, in the sense that this is like, which is what I mean by calling it like a parable of sorts, right? Like you could have expressed this in other ways, but I don't know. But both of those, you know, it's definitely the case that he's one of the best describers of urban alienation and just not feeling at home or attached to your position. And is one of the and yeah. So you know, maybe it isn't. But it seems like in the I don't know what people say about this book. From my broad understanding of like what seems to be the case, there does seem to be a split between people who want to read the modern surveillance stuff as like key, and other people who want it to be a tale as old as time that you could in principle tell in the medieval period in a different way.
Well, I mean, I think that I feel like in some ways these different, you know, your way of thinking, that way of thinking about it, and the way of thinking about it as a story about contemporary society, I think in some ways that's the point, right? The fact that it is a parable, it is key to all of this, because I mean, so there is this scene at the end of the book where he goes and the priest tells him a parable, right? He tells him the story before the law. And before the law is the story about this man, which, by the way, before the law was the only part of the trial that was published in Kafka's lifetime. He took it out of this text and he put it into, made it a short story and was part of a short story collection. The long and short of before the law is a man he gets to this door. Behind the door is the law. There's a guard standing in front of the door. The man asks for entrance into the door. The guard says, he says you can't go in, right? Is that what he says? You can't go in?
Yeah, he says you can try. He says you can try to go in.
Yeah.
But first of all, I'm very strong. And second of all, when you go in, there are going to be more people who are guarding further doors, and they're scarier than I am.
Yeah,
they're each even here to look at me.
That's right. Yeah. And he says, the guy tries to bribe the guard, and the guard takes the bribe, but still doesn't let in. But he just wants to say, I just want to make sure you didn't leave any stone unturned.
Yeah.
And eventually, you know, this man spends his whole life waiting to get into the law, waiting to get past the guard, and it never happens. And the man asks the guard, as he's having his dying moment, his sort of last moment on Earth, ask the guard, hey, if this is the entrance to the law, how come nobody else has ever come by here other than me looking to get in? And the guard, the last thing that this guy sees is the guard saying, he says, nobody else could gain admittance here. This entrance was meant only for you. I shall now go and close it. And that's it.
Right. Yeah.
And, you know, the interesting thing about this is a lot of people do use that story as a metaphor to kind of understand the trial as a whole. But the moment that follows that is really interesting too, because the priest who tells it basically says there's numerous ways to read this story. Like there's one way to go about reading it. And that to me is really the message of that moment.
Yeah. It's introduced as one of the introductory texts for somebody who would be, it seems like, going through the process to be part of this system, right? Mm-hmm. And the way it's read is like a Talmudic or like interpretative, like biblical text. Like it's like instead of reading a textbook about the law, it's that you have this weird story and then you have to try to make sense of it. And I think maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like the big disagreement that the two in the book have is whether or not the person who was guarding the door was a deceiver or not.
Yes.
Like, so whether or not in failing to disclose the information that this door was unique for that individual, right. This was an act of deception.
Right. That's the big disagreement. And again, along the sort of the lines of the, one participates in one's own subjugation, one of the pieces of evidence that's brought up is, he never asked. He never asked the actual question.
Right, exactly. He doesn't ask, is this a door just for me?
Yeah.
Because of course, why would you?
Yeah.
It's interesting. So I'm curious, what did you think the deception was? Because it seemed like the deception might be that if this is a door just for him, like, is he just supposed to be able to go in? Like, it wasn't clear to me what the act of deception was meant to be. Like, was it just keeping the fact that this was a personalized door from him? Or was there supposed to be more of a, does that entail something? Like the fact that this is his door? Like,
that
was unclear to me. Or did you think it was just the missing information?
I just thought it was the missing information. That's what I just thought. But it could be.
Yeah, and it could be. It could be. I just wondered what it meant practically for him. Like that this was his door. Like, what does that mean? What does that mean?
Right.
Maybe nothing.
It
seems like. Sorry, go on.
I just have a hard time kind of even thinking about what it means to have a door that gains you entrance into the law. that part is also.
Yeah. Well, I guess I was thinking that it's displayed as like this impersonal apparatus, and the idea that you would have your own access to it that's just for you is quite a shock.
Yeah.
Because it's like if you went to a Service Ontario and they said, actually, this is just for you. Like, it would be very strange. Like, this is just where you're to get your license and no one else comes here because this is your Service Ontario, right? Like, it's not what you'd expect. But I just wondered if there was supposed to be, like, it seemed like Kay thought maybe it meant something practically speaking, that it was like a personalized door. Like, I don't know, maybe. Yeah, I'm not sure. I had trouble figuring out what the import of the information was.
Yeah. Well, and I think that is, that lack of certainty about it is the key to why I think actually Kafka is such an effective writer. Now, maybe it would make other people very frustrated with him.
Yeah.
But right. I think that I remember actually the last time I remember really being acquainted with Before the Law, because I would have read it the first time I read the book, but I remember watching Orson Welles' adaptation of this movie. And he begins his movie with Before the Law.
Right.
With that story. And I just remember thinking, this is a crazy story. Like, I'd forgotten entirely about Before the Law. And I just remember thinking, wow, this is a really bizarre story. And yet it's oddly affecting in some way.
Yeah, it is.
Kafka is that you don't understand half of what's going on or why things are happening the way they're happening. But it is oddly effective. And maybe that's because of his that. A lot of people interpret Kafka through the lens of Freudian analysis. And
right.
And so maybe that's Kafka could really, he nicely is able to articulate that sort of unconscious state in his writing.
Right. Yeah, no, that could be. I mean, we were talking about this, and the only reference that I had in mind was Kierkegaard, just because I read quite a bit of Kierkegaard over the summer, and I looked into it, and it does seem like there's a fair amount of writing connecting them. I didn't read any of it, but I know that one of the things that people talk about is Kierkegaard's Abraham from Fear and Trembling, and I saw that Kafka had written for Abrahams, which is in some ways a critique of Kierkegaard. And I didn't spend a lot of time with it, but I felt like it was helpful for this novel. Only because Kierkegaard has this idea of Abraham as this very, very unworldly figure. Like, he's in the world, but he responds immediately to God's call. He sort of understands to some extent what's being demanded of him. And Kafka complained that he wasn't a real human being. And then he wrote this thing with different versions of Abraham. And the first one is basically like, he wants to do what God wants him to do, but he's too busy at his job. And so he keeps putting it off. And like, he's willing to sacrifice his son, but basically there's always one more thing in his life that needs to be done.
Yeah.
And then the other versions are basically, they don't even have children. And they still think that they have to sacrifice their child. So it felt like some of this book, like that was influential in the way I was thinking about it after I read it. Is like, some of it seems to be an attempt to locate this encounter between a huge entity that's mysterious and all powerful and a person, but like make it more realistic.
Right.
Like, how would a person really respond to this? Like, will they go up to the mountain right away? Or are they more likely to try to make excuses?
Right. Right.
And there were the three outcomes, right? That seems important. The three outcomes to which a trial can go, short of being found guilty, right?
Well, according to the painter, right? So
according to the painter.
Yeah. So at one point, Kay gets this tip. Right. There's another thing is that he keeps going to different people with the hope that they'll give him some kind of help. And the first one actually is this Fräulein Burster who we talked about how he assaults her in her room. And but before that, she talks about, I'm going to be working at the law office, and he says, maybe you can help me, and she's like, yeah, maybe I can, and then she never speaks to him again after that.
Yeah.
Which
he assaults her.
Yeah, it's understandable.
Yeah.
And so there's that, and then there is the washerwoman in the assembly who's also assaulted in the book. And she says that, I can help you with what's going on because I have connections to the, I think I have connections to the director or to the examining magistrate or something like that. But then she gets carried off by this student who's always kind of, apparently, according to her husband, always vying for her attention. Again, in that moment too, the husband is like, I would probably be able to stop this if I just confronted him, but I can't. So once again, It's like this like subjugation to power. And then what are some other moments? So then there's the advocate, and then there's the advocate's maid, Lenny, and then he gets this tip from Titorelli, a painter who paints the judges. And Titorelli says, I could help you. There's 3 ways that you can be acquitted. One is like a total acquittal.
Right, which is very unlikely to happen.
Yeah, he says he's never seen anybody who has been completely acquitted. Now, once again, just in terms of like the idea of like not being able to rely on some eternal truth, he's told by Lenny, the maid, who's like, you have to acknowledge your guilt. If you can acknowledge your guilt, then you'll be able to become free. And then, but Titorelli, the painter, says, if you're innocent, then it's possible to depend just on your innocence. So it's like everybody who he goes to is telling him something different. But then Titorelli says also, like, I've never seen anybody who has been found totally has been totally exculpated for their crimes. So then there's an ostensible acquittal, and an indefinite postponement.
Right.
But either way, with one of those two, he's still kind of under the control of the law for the rest of his life.
Yeah, because the ostensible acquittal is like they exonerate you temporarily, but that your case might always be taken back up at a later date, right? And then the other one is like you so exhaust the legal system by going through petitions and things, or just meeting with your people for your weekly interrogations that you keep things going forever.
Yeah. So what do you think? What do you think of those 3 of the 3?
I don't know, but they do seem once again to be the 3. They seem to be responses that one could take either to the certainty of death or the certainty of being finite. Like the idea being like, we have this ability to know that we could be doing anything, but we, of course, can only do one thing. But we're aware of all kinds of possibilities that we'll never realize. And that creates a certain kind of, I don't know, a feeling of needing to justify why you've done what you've done. That doesn't seem to go away. And it seems like the ways in which you could deal with that would be to do something that would make you feel temporarily okay, like you achieve something, and then you feel for a little while, like you write a book or you do something, you feel for a little while like, oh, okay, like that would be like the temporary the ostensible acquittal. Or you can just keep yourself really busy and forget about it and feel like because you're active and you're moving towards something, like you don't feel the weight of unrealized possibilities.
Right.
And that's my broad reading is something like that, like that you feel a sense of needing to justify yourself, and you haven't done anything per se wrong, but who knows?
Right.
You've chosen to make some things happen and other things can't happen.
Right.
And I don't know, that always feels horrible.
But if you think of, like, to go back to your earlier point, that if this sort of big thing that's impossible to grasp is, let's say, death.
Yeah.
Like you're saying, you could fill your life up with things as a way to kind of, not have to confront those kind of realities about life. But to borrow Tittarelli's phrase, there's never a total acquittal.
That's right. There's never a total acquittal.
You're never going to beat it out.
Although it's interesting because, again, like this is where I do think that like the like sort of Protestant religious ideas seem to be that he gets from Kierkegaard maybe seem to be driving some of this, because like Tittarelli differentiates between what's said in theory and what happens in practice, right? So he says, theoretically the law will always acquit someone who's innocent.
Yeah.
But theoretically the judges also aren't influenced. But in practice, it doesn't ever seem to happen. It seems to me like the law, like it seems to me like the biblical law, the idea being, look, God's given this law, so you're supposed to be able to do this stuff, but then everybody is guilty. So it's this law that ideally you're supposed to be able to follow. Otherwise, why would God give the law? But then if you're sort of a Protestant Christian, or even, I think, Jew, you probably think that there are lots of interpretations on which no one has ever lived up to their end of the bargain.
Right.
And so it's like this weird thing where theoretically you ought to be able to be fine and exonerate yourself. But in fact, in practice, no one's ever been able to do that. And it doesn't work as a law if it's impossible to follow. Right. But in practice it is.
Right.
I don't know.
No, I think that's well, and I think that I also sort of mentioned to you that in some ways, it almost seems just like the man who's sitting in front of in front of the door of law, the entrance to law. That the book really is like, it's kind of about like, it's as if this sort of system has been set up specifically to try to. The point of it is to try to get Kay to just keep on fighting against it. Like you're just going to spend your whole life waiting around.
Right.
And I do think, again, it's kind of, maybe the fact that it starts when he turns 30 is a kind of sad commentary on adulthood, because it's like, once you turn 30, the rest is just basically, you're now going to be caught up in the system where you're just waiting around the rest of your life. Yeah.
I mean, definitely from Kafka's biography, I mean, if anyone has a dislike of having to work in an office, it's Kafka, like that's one of the things that resonates so strongly, that he's constantly looking for time to write, and constantly, and, it seems like the happiest years of his life, from what I could gather, were when he was incapable of working.
Yeah.
When he was in Germany, I think, and he was at a sanatorium and he couldn't work for a couple of years. That's when he was most productive.
Yes. Yeah. It's true. And that's a thing that I think is so great about Kafka, is how work figures into his writing, because it doesn't appear in quite the same way. Like, he talks a lot about Kafka talks about, I think, I don't know about a lot, but he talks about being a kind of a descendant of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy.
Blood brother, I think he says.
Yeah. But Dostoevsky doesn't really talk about work that much in his writing.
That's true. That's
he talks
true.
a little bit about it, but not that much. But it dominates Kafka's, like when Gregor Samsa turns into the vermin, the first thing he thinks about is, oh, I'm going to be late for work.
Yeah, for sure.
And this book here, you know, they arrest him, but they say, oh, but you can still go and work. And another story that I just found out about over the last couple of days is, and you mentioned this, you suggested this too with the Abraham stories too, but he also has a story about Poseidon, which
Kafka does?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. I don't think I've ever read that.
And it is actually, let me see if I could just quickly look it up so that I can get this exactly right. So Poseidon, he writes it in 1920, and it's about Poseidon is sitting at a desk. I'm reading the description on Wikipedia. Poseidon is sitting at a desk and makes calculations on the waters he has to manage. For his work, he could rely on staff, but rather prefers to work on his own. He does not like his work, but he sees no alternative. I mean,
that's funny.
Yeah, I mean, that again is like perfect Kafka, right? It's like it's Poseidon, the king of the seas, and here he is, like just busy, like, oh, I wish I didn't. Once again today, this grind of having to be the king of the seas and managing things.
Yeah,
and that is so, like, that is at the heart of so much of what Kafka writes.
Yeah, it's also very funny. It's a funny. Yeah. I mean, it's a very funny story, like from the description.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I was thinking
Kafka is funny.
Yeah, so it's true. It's true. Sometimes not ha funny. Like no. I've read a lot of I've read a lot of things where people say, "Oh, Kafka's hilarious," but I've never. Some stories I think are funny, and there are things that happen, but I don't think there were any places where this time reading through the trial I was really laughing loudly. There's a humor in like the situation, whereas the story that you just said about Poseidon sounds funny. It sounds like it might be in like a Woody Allen movie or something.
Yeah, right? That's true. That's true. No, there's some there's some moments that I found humorous in this, but no, nothing that certainly makes me laugh out loud. Definitely.
Right. I was thinking while you were talking about the individualized door into the law, it's weird because there are a couple of places in this book where there is like a weird dream logic where there's a part where he's going up the stairs. You know what I'm talking about? There's a part where he's going up the stairs and he doesn't know which staircase to take. And he reasons that, in fact, since the law is attracted to guilt, whatever staircase he takes will be the right one. Like, I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. It's a really weird thing that I don't feel like I feel that it sticks out.
Yeah.
It's when he's first looking for the. It's somewhere near the beginning of the book. I think it's this when he goes in on the Sunday. And then he's looking. The other thing that happens in that same chapter is he's looking for where the hearing is supposed to be, and he says he's looking for a carpenter named Lance. And then at some point, it's totally made up. He just doesn't want to admit what's happening. And then this woman goes, "Oh, I know where Lance is. He's right here." And she just takes him into where his trial is. Yes. Right? Like it's weird because she pretends that she knows. It seems like in that chapter, there's this almost feeling that some of this is happening. And the same goes for him ringing the doorbell and then they get him. Like there's a weird like responsiveness to him.
Yeah.
That seems to happen and is like dreamlike, like that he goes to a place and it seems totally random. And then, oh, this is actually where you're supposed to be.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there is a kind of, and Kay does make a few remarks about this where it almost does seem at a certain point as if he's almost like part of a play.
Yeah.
And actually, I think one of the most overt examples of that is actually, I think is maybe my vote for the weirdest part of the book.
Okay.
Where he's so earlier in the book, I have to preface this a little bit. Earlier in the book, when he first goes to that assembly hall and he starts to he's in front of the examining magistrate and he's feeling very good about himself for pulling off the court and what a sham this all is. And he thinks that he's getting the audience on his side and he thinks he's being very rhetorically persuasive. But he talks about how, when when the people came to arrest him, they messed up his house, they ate his breakfast, they did all of this stuff. Then a few weeks later, he's at work and he goes down to this random room in his workplace at the bank, and he opens up the door. And in this room, the two people who he said, messed up his home and ate his breakfast are being whipped by a court-appointed whipper. And they like plead with Kay, like tell him we didn't do, tell him we're not as bad as, get us out of this. Like, you got us into this, you can get us out of it. And he tries, but he's weird. But the real weird part is that he's so like profoundly, he is weirded out by this moment. Like, oh my God, like what? First of all, why were they being whipped in my bank of all places? This random. And so the next day, he's got this on his head. Like, he keeps thinking about this, and he goes by the room, and it's like, I'm gonna just check this room again. And the same thing is going on again in the room.
Yeah, they're still there.
They're still there.
Yeah, that is a weird part.
And they do once again this like help, and he just closes the door and he's like, I'm getting out of here. Forget it.
Yeah, it's weird, and also that's another theme in the book is that the legal proceedings just basically, take over other locations, right? So they never have buildings of their own. They always clear out somebody's living room and have their thing there. And in that case, they're just in a junk room, which gets repurposed by these people for their punishment. It's the part I was thinking of, it's this, Jesse. It says, then he went up the first set of stairs after all. So he's looking at these stairs and not sure where he's to go. His mind playing with the memory of the remark the guard Willem had made that the court was attracted by guilt, from which it actually followed that the room for the inquiry would have to be located off whatever stairway Kay chanced to choose. It's a weird, I don't know. Maybe it means nothing. But in this chapter, there's a couple of weird things. And then the thing happens with Lance. Does a carpenter named Lance live here? Yes, this way, please. The young woman takes him. And she just takes him to the trial. And then it seems like perhaps they know that he's been asking this because he assumes that he's a painter. And I wondered if that was meant to be connected to the carpenter question or if it's just random. I don't know.
Well, so a couple things there. So if his point about guilt stands, then that does suggest on some level he does feel guilty about something, because it's just his own guilt will take him to the courtroom,
right?
Inevitably. But I mentioned before this kind of like Freudian aspect to Kafka, and I think actually the term nightmarish gets deployed incorrectly to a lot of things. Like it gets people use the word to describe horror movies, but horror movies actually almost never like a nightmare. Because a nightmare, to me, at least my nightmares, the nightmares that I have, and maybe I'll be revealing a lot here about
probably
beyond the ones where my teeth fall out. But actually kind of like that, where it's a nightmare really only has one awful part in it, and it just comes at the very end of a kind of a stream of kind of unusual things. It's almost like a kind of normal dream until something really bad happens.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I have nightmares that are really just unmitigated fear.
Horror?
For what seems like 20 minutes. Sometimes I have what you're having, where it's like a random dream and things are good and then suddenly something awful happens. But I also have this doesn't let up, some being chased. Yeah. You never have dreams where you're being chased?
No, I don't.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I find that I wake myself up as soon as I am aware that I'm dreaming. For example, I wake up and as soon as anything bad happens, I wake up. And maybe I'm just not deep enough of a sleeper.
Maybe you're a coward.
I'm just constantly. I go to bed petrified.
Yeah, and then you wake up, because I stay in the bad dreams, try to problem solve for a long time, but I have a lot of dreams where it's like 20 minutes of fear.
Oh, that's terrible. That's not good. So I guess in some ways, he's so okay. So I'll acknowledge that maybe the term nightmarish is deployed correctly because I don't have regular nightmare. Or I only have.
I don't know. Yeah, maybe there's something weird about you, or maybe you're pretty standard. I don't know.
I don't know either, but we'll have. This is a video for another episode, I think, where J Hutch and R explore the depths of their inner consciousnesses. But which I'd be happy to have. But
yeah, that would be a good episode.
I think it would be a good one. I think we could all learn something from that. But I do think that I could see Kafka's stories being more like the kind of dreams that I tend to have, where it is just a lot of like there's normal things, but within that normal realm, there's just things that tend to not really happen,
Right.
So like the lands thing, like when he goes, he kind of explains it. Like I use the name Lands because it was the name of the guy who now lives in my building. Right. But now I'm saying he's a carpenter, and then there's the painter, and then there's the painter later on in the story, and there's this kind of this weird like things come in and they come back and they go away, and and just sort of things that you would think would make sense happen, and then they don't. Like again, like the washerwoman, he has this conversation with the washerwoman, and then the student comes and he sweeps her away and he sweeps her up the steps. Yeah, and it's like there is something like there is a kind of dream-like logic to the book as a whole, I think.
Yeah. And repetition, like there are those little kids on the stairs the first time he goes up, and then there are kids on the stairs when he goes to see the painter. There are just these little, and like the painter thing that you mentioned, I really noticed that he's asking, that he's asked whether he's a painter, and then he has a painter later. I mean, it's strange. It doesn't really seem to like fit together into any sort of thing, but there are these weird repetitions.
Yeah. And actually one repetition that I noticed when I was reading it like a second time in this particular round of readings, so that scene that we talked about before where, he goes back to the assembly and he has this kind of dizzy spell and he has to get carried out. That is in some ways foreshadowing the last scene of the book, because he's being, they're taking him by the arm.
Yeah.
And one on either side of them. And he's kind of listening as the two are having this debate back and forth, like, oh, he's telling you too much about what happens here. He's like, I'm only telling him because of this. And they have this weird thing of back and forth. And then at the end, the two executioners are having this weird debate that doesn't include language, but it's where they're passing the knife back and forth to each other as if like who's going to kill him. And so that moment is kind of foreshadowed earlier on, but I don't know why. I don't know if there's a reason for that. It just is like there is just that moment that comes back a couple times.
Yeah, no, that's right. I hadn't thought of that, but yeah, it seems like they want him to kill himself usually, right? Like the way he describes it is like that would happen, but he's too tired or something.
Yeah. But along the lines of this what you're describing here with the scene with where he talks looking, he's looking for lands and and also the scene with the whipper. Like the scene with the whipper, I think like the reason why that's happening in the bank is because he's meant to find those things. Like he's meant to come across.
Yeah, that's I guess that's right. Yeah, no, I guess that's right. I mean, I think it would have been quite funny if Lance showed up. Like then I would have laughed out loud. So I said, "Oh, it's me, Lance. You're asking for me, right?" Like then we would know something was fishy.
Yeah, that would be.
But there is a certain way. Yeah, but you're right. Like he's meant to find those things. Yeah, and then there are things that he ends up finding that he's not meant to find, but then it seems like he is meant to find them. Like he runs into a random person. He wants to go somewhere, and then they're like, "Oh, I'll take you."
Yeah.
Yeah.
But another like and again, now that we're talking about it, there are these kind of moments that I do find funny when you kind of think about them.
Yeah.
When you read like when he goes to visit Titorelli the painter, like he just keeps piling on painting after painting because he's like, do you want this painting? And he's like, sure, I'll take it. He's like, how about this one? And all the paintings look exactly the same.
Yeah, they're identical. And he says they're part of a series, but they're the same. Yeah.
So there is that. And there was something else too. I can't remember, but yeah, I mean, just kind of funny moments like that. And again, that does seem kind of dreamlike to me. Like, here's a painting.
Yeah.
Like, here's a painting. And you look at it, and it's the same as the last one.
Yeah. No, that's true. That's true.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, there is, I think, this aspect of the story where it's like, oh, I'm this is a game. It does still almost always feel like a game. Oh yeah, the other part that I was thinking of too is when he goes back the second time and he's talking with the washerwoman, and they're like, these are the law books. Like, you're not supposed to look at them. It's like, oh, they must be important. And he opens it up finally, and it's like 19th century pornography, basically.
Yeah, exactly. There's one that looks like, there's like an image, right, of two people naked on a couch. And then it's a drawing, and then there's a book which could either be erotica or romance. Like, it's something like the sufferings that Hans subjects his wife to, or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's unclear. Yeah, I couldn't tell what.
A very Kafkaesque way, I actually just right away opened up the page to that.
There you go.
To that.
Yeah.
Torment Greta had to suffer from her husband Hans, which doesn't sound pornographic to me, but given that
it's hard to say.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think Kafka was weird when it came to sexuality. I've read some things.
Yeah. Yes.
A lot of prostitutes.
Yeah. There's a kind of a bit of a Tolstoy thing going on there with Kafka.
Well, it's weird just because the sex scenes like really feel dreamlike, just because the way that there's no sexual tension, and then suddenly someone is trying to kiss him, or he's trying, like, they just come so out of nowhere.
Yeah.
That which they feel more disconcerting to me than many of the other things in the book. Intentionally, like they're not arousing. They're more just like random.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Yeah, I don't know. I wonder. I mean, we could psychoanalyze Kafka, but like, I do wonder, like, a lot of the relationships, at least that I'm aware of. I mean, he was a guy who did seem to like fall in love very quickly.
But then never got married.
And could never bring himself to get married. And so like there was something definitely going on there with Kafka.
Yeah, something fishy.
Yeah. but just one other, like, another thing that I do want to bring up too is I read a quote of somebody who knew Kafka who said, that Kafka was just a guy who fundamentally could not understand the world and the way people acted. And I do think, I mean, which is, on the one hand, it doesn't make sense because he is such a good writer, and I feel like you have to understand things pretty well in order to be such a good writer. But on the other hand, it makes total sense when you look at what's happening in these stories, where you do have characters who are completely adrift.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Another thing too, just to bring up the biography of Kafka a little bit, was his strange eating habits. And apparently, one time he walked into. I'm not going to do justice to the story because I can't remember what the other person was eating, and I can't remember what Kafka suggested in its place. But he went in and basically said, like, "Oh, how could you eat?" This guy was eating this delicious meal, and Kafka was like, "Oh, disgusting! How could you eat that? The only thing you should eat is like," and it was like pure lard or something like that. Like, it was just like awful. And but again, it's like, this is a guy who's completely out of place in the world.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that could be. Although, I mean, it's true. I've heard that he seems handsome. I wondered about that. I always wonder what Kafka must have, what kind of figure he cut, just because, I don't know. He seems to have strange ideas about how sexual relationships develop. At least in the books, like, they seem to be a lot more abrupt than what I've encountered. And I always wonder, like, is this reality for Kafka? Like, what is this? Like, why does he write it this way? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think he had a firm grasp on those things. Just based on like the big relationship of his life is this Felice Bauer lady.
Yeah.
and he meets her the one time, I think, and she's lives in Germany, right? And he lives
yeah.
And then like he's instantly in love with her. He's just writing letters to her, and then they're engaged. And I mean, also maybe it just has a little bit to do with the time, because people would meet and then just not be able to see each other for like months.
I mean that's true, and people weren't able to, I don't know, probably express attraction in a more piecemeal way.
Yeah. So I don't know, but okay, sorry, but I can let you go, but
no. I'm leaning on this. I'm getting a bit groggy.
Okay, so I do want to ask. I want to ask you two things before we.
Yeah.
The first thing is what's the weirdest? What do you think is the weirdest moment in this book? Is it that moment with where he goes to the assembly for the first time, or is it another?
Let me see. Let me just see here.
The other question that I have is, so you can decide which one you want to answer first, is because you came on to talk about Plato's Republic last time, and we were talking about how Plato would potentially find room for certain texts or certain artificial things in the Republic. And I'll probably, every time you come on the podcast, I'll ask you this question until you finally tell me to stop asking you this.
Yeah, okay. Would Plato allow this?
Yes.
I don't think that Plato would allow it.
Right.
I think he's going to say no, because it suggests a picture of the universe that makes rational activity meaningless. So I would say no. Because the whole thing is like he's trying to approach this rationally, and the further you try, the more screwed up the situation gets. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's too profoundly nihilistic. I don't know. Right. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the same thing for that reason, for the same thing. And again, I would say that it's like, it is just to harken back a little bit to the Max Weber point. Like, that's just the thing. Like, as soon as you, in the realm of the sciences, if science is displacing religion, the only thing that when you look for answers, the only thing that comes out of it is more questions, basically.
Yeah, right.
That's the world,
I see. Okay. I understand that now.
Yeah, and so that's the world that essentially, Kafka and people in general are living in at the beginning of the 20th century, and they would have at least a kind of generational memory, maybe, of what the world was like before that,
right?
Where there were these kind of ultimate answers to questions, but now it's a world where every answer produces more questions, which is kind of, to me, that's sort of the world that Kay is living in. But as you say, that's also makes it an unlikely candidate for the Republic as well.
Yeah, I think Plato would say no, not that one. We're going to pass. Forget it.
Yeah. I like the idea of Plato like sitting behind a desk. Actually, it almost seems like a Kafka story of Plato sitting.
Yeah, like that one. Forget it. Forget that.
I hate being a philosopher. All this work that I have to do. Okay, so weirdest part of the text.
I don't. I guess probably the part that I pointed out with the stairs, just because I'm not really sure how to take it.
Yeah.
I guess also it's weird to me. Something that I'm not sure. Like, in a similar vein is like at the end, he's taken to the cathedral. He's supposed to be there to take this Italian guy around, and he's really obsessed with doing a fairly decent job, but he's very upset about having to do it. Like, he's bringing the translation of some words that he's going to need to use, and then he just ends up there, and it turns out that he's supposed to be there to meet with this priest. And it's not really explained. Like, was this a setup? Like, this is another one of these dreamlike things where he goes there and somebody says to him, I guess what's dreamlike about it is that he just accepts it. Like, he doesn't say, like, what are you talking about? Like, I'm supposed to be here to meet this other guy. Like, what do you mean? Like, I'm supposed to be here to meet you. Yeah. What a weird coincidence. Like, I guess earlier on he says coincidence a couple times, but that's weird to me because I don't quite understand what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, to me, like, not a laugh out loud moment, but also funny that he's the only person in there, and suddenly this priest gets up and he's like, is he really gonna is he really going to just deliver this sermon? And I'm the only one here. Like this,
and he's worried that he's going to be stuck.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then he just says his name, right? He just
Yes.
goes, okay.
Yeah. Well, and there's also that moment too where the priest just gets angry with him, where
right.
because the priest says to him, you know, you're looking for outside help too much, which again is such an interesting comment after he spent so much of the book thinking, now suddenly, you know, at first he thinks nobody can help me, then he thinks other people can help me. Now he's got a priest saying, you're relying too much on outside help.
Yeah.
And then he says, well, you know, some people can help. He's like, you know, women, the priest says, you're relying too much on women to help you. And he says, well, you know, women can be quite influential. And the priest really gets angry. He's like, can you not even see in front of his face?
Yeah, he insinuates that like the men of the court are womanizers, right?
Yes.
He says something like, if you throw a woman in front of them, they'll like go after her.
Yeah, they're lechers. Yeah. They're lechers. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna maybe just, you can give your final thoughts in just a second, but yeah, my assessment of this book is that it is like it's you know, a demonstration of sort of the state of the world in that early 20th century, where, you know, things were this kind of fundamentally ungraspable in a way that before were thought to be graspable. But also at the same time, you lose your humanity with this kind of intense bureaucratic system. And I would say that the bureaucracy is not just the law, but that Kay also refers to his workplace as a huge bureaucracy as well. So everything is a bureaucracy. So you have these two things sort of developing in the 19th century, the bureaucracy, and which dehumanizes people, but also a kind of loss of these fundamental truths, which are then replaced by kind of systems of understanding where all answers just lead to more and more questions.
Right.
And so anyway, so that's my way. But what are your final thoughts? Not to put you on the spot.
No, my final thoughts are I don't know what to say about this. In summation, good book.
Yes.
Highly recommend.
Yeah. Fair enough.
It's a classic for a reason.
Well, and another thing is that you should resist kind of looking. Certainly, you should resist looking at it only in the way that I suggested, because.
Well, I think both of the ways that we're looking at it are complementary, and it's a better book if it's both.
Yes.
Right. It's definitely, it doesn't need to be just one thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that would go against the very spirit of Kafka in the first place, anyway.
Right. Have you read The Castle?
No, but it's going to be the next one that I do for this series.
Yeah, I'll see. I'm curious whether The Castle has a couple of parts that make me laugh out loud. It's funnier, but it's very similar.
Yes,
it's basically the same book.
Well, that's what I was wondering, and I was wondering
it is the same.
Yeah.
So if I were you, I would put off reading it for a video for a while, because if people see a video on The Castle after this video, they're probably going to think it's the same video. Really, because they're sort of the opposite, right? Like in The Castle, he's trying to get information on other people, get access to the castle. Very similar.
Well, here's what we should do. Here's what I think we should do.
All right.
You ready for this idea?
Okay.
We do the next. You come back to do The Castle with me.
Okay.
We talk about it like it's a different book. We say exactly the same things.
Some of the same things could be there, yeah, for sure.
We type out a script, and then we basically read out everything that we just said.
Sure, and we see if people catch on.
See if people catch on. No, I promised my audience I will not do that. But
you won't repeat episodes.
That's right. So, Herr R, tell me about your YouTube channel.
So I have music. I go by the name Port Hope. I have a lot. I have, I think, 3 different projects right now. I've written a lot of songs. 2 of them are meant for sort of like musical podcasts that aren't really musicals in the standard sense of like a drama. They're more musicals in a thematic sense. they're not really like concept albums either. I don't really know what to say about them. I don't know, but they're pretty self-referential. I have one that's about a murder, the Black Dahlia, murder that took place in Los Angeles. Another one that's about Antarctica, the exploration of Antarctica, the failed journey that ended in 5 deaths. But both of them are like in this universe that involves a character that's sort of like me and a time machine and a talking parrot.
Yes.
And so, yeah, it's I don't know. I don't really know what to say about like how to classify it, but
well, they're very interesting. I mean, I think to me, it strikes me that it's rather than being one thing, like saying it's a concept album, that it is sort of doing multiple things at once, right? It's telling a story,
yeah,
but it's also music, but
yeah,
like almost separate things in that sense, rather like unlike like Tommy, which is telling a story through music.
Exactly. Well, and I try to figure out like because I in theory like the idea of a musical, but I don't actually like musicals very much, and so I just try to figure out like what don't I like about a standard concept album, and what I don't like are the songs that are there just to move the plot along.
Right.
Meaning, there's usually a song where it's like, we're the workers and we like to work. And it's like, no one wants to listen to that song,
Yeah, right.
And so I don't know, to try to get that out. But also, I'm pretty influenced. I think the biggest influence on me is like SCTV. Because throughout the podcast projects, they have adverts for other things that don't exist. And they have promos for each other. And I like the idea of like, so like all the songs I've written about the Black Dahlia, they're not all on that album. Like I have another, like there's no album to speak of, but like basically I've written a lot of songs and I'm putting them in baskets. But I like the idea of having a world that's like bigger than what you see and has like dead ends and things that exist as like promos, but not actual shows. They do that on SCTV a lot where like sometimes they give you the show, but a lot of times it's like you get this 30-second promo for something else. You think this is the coolest, but you never see it.
Right.
I don't know. Right. I want to make a self-contained something because it's hard to make music and have people be interested. Like I don't know. I want to do something more.
Yeah, it's a grand narrative.
Exactly.
That encompasses various different mediums.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right, Jesse.
Yeah, it's great. And I highly recommend people
check me out every weekend. There's shows. Jesse will put the link up there.
Yeah, I will. Yeah,
getting better. Haven't really tried to get an audience yet beyond my friends, but someday soon. I'm getting ready.
Yeah, well, that's how I feel about this.
Yeah, exactly.
The same thing.
Well, you have to do it for about a year before you get feeling like you're doing a good enough job. I think that you want other people to see it.
Yeah,
that's absolutely how I feel.
Absolutely. But you are doing a great job, and I will put up the link for you here. And while we're here, just if you are watching this and you like this video, please feel free to give it a little like. If you happen to be listening to it on the audio version of it, please feel free to rate, review the podcast as well.
Yeah, it's very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. It is very.
People probably don't realize how helpful it is.
Yeah,
just for someone to hit like. It takes like 2 seconds, but it means a lot.
It does. It absolutely does mean a lot. It's very, very helpful. So yeah, I do. That would be fantastic. It's always a pleasure having you on these conversations.
Yeah. I'm always willing to come back. I love it's my second favorite YouTube program after my own.
Yeah. So I might feel the same way. So, but yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. Actually,
all right.
Let me just set up our my
outro music.
Yeah.
Where'd you get that music, by the way? Is that just like a stock, or did you record it yourself? What is that?
That's mine.
I like it. Yeah, you wrote it?
Yeah.
So it's a Wonder Boys track.
It's a Wonder Boys track. It's
I like it. It's perfect, man.
Yeah,
it really pumps you up.
Yeah, it's part of a Wonder Boy track, and I've just taken out the words and things like that.
That's good. It sounds really good.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you. I shouldn't have said yeah to that. It sounds really good. Yeah, it does. You're right.
Yeah, it does. No, it is good. It's I really like that theme. It gets stuck in my head.
Oh, good. So yeah, thanks so much. I hope this has been enjoyable.
It has been. It has been very enjoyable.
Good. And I hope you come back at some point.
I will. Anytime, Jesse. Anytime.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
All right.
All right.
Good night. Good night, folks.
Bye-bye. Take care.